You're being called, in essence, the leader of the Never Trump movement right now. The fact is that you say there are principles that come before supporting your party's nominee. You hoped someone else would emerge as the Republican nominee. That has not happened. So will you now consider last-ditch running?
No, that's something I'm not going to be doing. I'd like to see someone run, but I think that's not very likely. And the reason for that, of course, is that it's almost impossible for a third-party candidate to receive the 270 electoral votes that are necessary to actually become president, or to stop Hillary Clinton or Trump from getting the necessary 270. So I think you're not going to find a credible candidate actually running as a third-party contender.
So there's no possibility in your opinion?
Well, I'm not planning on doing that, and have no intention to do that.
You're not doing it. All right. You have said that Donald Trump, in your words, would sink the country into a prolonged recession, that he is not smart on foreign policy. Your words, that he's a con man, a phony, a fraud, and a fake. If you feel that strongly, why don't you think you have an obligation to run right now?
Well, because he has become the nominee of the Republican Party, and the only way to win the White House, in my view, is to become a nominee of either the Republican or the Democrat Party. And simply running to be a spoiler would not give the American people, I think, the chance to express their own views about Mr. Trump or about Secretary Clinton. I think they will do so. I myself will not be voting for either one of them. I just can't bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton. I don't think the policies that she promotes are right for the country. And Mr. Trump, I think, is too great a departure from the values of our country for me to sign up as a voter for him either. So I'll be writing in someone else's name. It'll be probably another Republican.
But isn't that sort of, I mean, you're going to write in some other name that has no chance, but isn't that copping out right now of your responsibility?
Well, my responsibility was to express to the American people what I believed was right about the potential nominee of our party. And I did so very plainly and clearly. And the people who made the choice decided to go a different direction. That's their right. But as an individual, I simply can't put my name down as someone who voted for principles that suggest racism or xenophobia, misogyny, bigotry, who's been vulgar time and time again. And the most recent attack on Judge Curiel, a racist approach, is one which I think says to me, I can't be part of that. I will not sign up for that. I don't want to be associated with that in any way, shape, or form.
So what do you say to people like your vice presidential running mate, Paul Ryan, who is very critical of Donald Trump, does not like any of the words he said about Judge Curiel, called it a textbook definition for a racist comment, but he still says he's going to support Donald Trump?
Well, I don't argue with people who've come to a different conclusion. They're looking at the two candidates and deciding who they think is best able to serve our country at this time. And I'm sure there's some things they'd like to change, and in whoever they're going to support. Every candidate has a problem or two, or maybe more than that. But for me, Mr. Trump's problems are of such a dramatic nature, such a departure from the values of our country and my own personal values, that I can't sign up to be part of his campaign.
Are you disappointed Paul Ryan has endorsed them?
I wish everybody in the Republican Party had rejected Mr. Trump and chosen someone else. But my choice is different than that of the other people, and I'm certainly not going to argue with them about their choice. Their view is that Secretary Clinton would so dramatically change the nature of the Supreme Court that represents a threat to our future. I understand that perspective, but I find that compelling, but also the Donald Trump failure is also compelling.
Should Paul Ryan take back that endorsement?
Oh, look, I wish every Republican who supported Mr. Trump said, I made a mistake, let's go a different direction. But that's not going to happen. The people have spoken, and we're going to have Donald Trump as the Republican nominee.
Because how can you square, would you say, racist comments, xenophobia, misogyny, all of these other things? How can you square that with then still going ahead and voting in favor of that candidate?
Well, I can't, and that's why I have reached the decision I have. And over the coming campaign, Mr. Trump will probably be able to adjust his rhetoric and follow the script of a written speech in such a way that he won't be quite as offensive on these value issues as he has been in the past. But unfortunately, what he's said already demonstrates who he is and the nature of the character of the man. And for me, that's something which is will not be erased by rhetoric in the coming months.
You don't believe he can change?
Oh, I believe he can change his rhetoric. I believe he can hide who he is, but I believe that who he is has been revealed by his lifetime and by the words in the campaign that he's spoken to this point.
Because he did tone down his rhetoric in that speech the other day. He read it from
No
a
question.
teleprompter. Reince Priebus, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, who's here this weekend with you, he called it a great victory speech and the right approach. Trump says it's time to move on right now. Is that okay with you if he moves on and you forget about all the other stuff? I don't think you think it's a time to move on.
Well, I can imagine that Mr. Trump would like to have people move on and forget what was said during the primary process and what's been said over the years. But we actually take the measure of an individual over their entire career and during the primary as well. And on that basis, we get a sense of the person's character, integrity, honesty, their values with regards to race and religion and gender. And Mr. Trump has made that pretty clear through the campaign to this point. I'm absolutely convinced that Reince Priebus is right when he says that Mr. Trump will be able to read from the text and present a different image going forward. But that is not something which is consistent with who he is, as demonstrated by his past.
So you don't think he should get a pass if he stops talking about Judge Curiel?
Well, everyone else could make their assessment, but he indicated what he believes in his heart about Mexicans and about race by the comments he made about Judge Curiel, and he may try and distance himself from that today, but we know what he believes based on what he said. And by the way, he didn't just say it once. It wasn't a slip of the tongue which he went back and apologized for. First of all, he's repeated it time and time again, and secondly, he's never apologized for it. So he obviously sticks by what he believes.
What would he have to do to win your support?
Well, I don't think there's anything I'm looking for from Mr. Trump to give him my support. He's demonstrated who he is, and I've decided that a person of that nature should not be the one who, if you will, becomes the example for coming generations or the example of America to the world. Look, I don't want to see trickle-down racism. I don't want to see a president of the United States saying things which change the character of the generations of Americans that are following. Presidents have an impact on the nature of our nation. And trickle-down racism, trickle-down bigotry, trickle-down misogyny, all these things are extraordinarily dangerous to the heart and character of America. And so I'm not looking for Mr. Trump to change a policy that more aligns with my own. This is not a matter of just policy. It's more a matter of character and integrity.
You think he's a racist?
Oh, I think his comments time and again appeal to the racist tendency that exists in some people, and I think that's very dangerous.
Hillary Clinton took a page out of your playbook this past week, using Donald Trump's own words against him. She painted a picture of why she thinks he is dangerous. He would be a dangerous commander-in-chief, in her words, and temperamentally unfit. You agree with her on that, don't you?
I'm not sure I'm going to sign up with all of her words, but...
Is he temperamentally unfit to be president?
Well, I've already said, in my view, that the temperament that Mr. Trump has demonstrated is not consistent with a world which is as combustible as it has ever been during my lifetime. And I mean, if you look around the world, China's assertiveness, North Korea's nuclear capability, Syria, a number of other failed states like Syria, Afghanistan still troubled, Pakistan with over 100 nuclear weapons, and so forth. This is a very dangerous world and requires a person who is thoughtful, knowledgeable, curious intellectually, willing to listen to other people, to change their mind based upon the advice of other people. And I haven't seen those qualities to the extent I'd want to see them in a president, in Mr. Trump to this point.
You clearly have misgivings about Hillary Clinton, but a lot of Republicans do, but some say she's the lesser of two evils. Would you be in that camp?
Well, I understand people who've come to a different conclusion than I have. Those that support, Republicans that support Mr. Trump are saying, gosh, Hillary Clinton would appoint a more liberal court, and that's very troubling. and her policies are, in many cases, destructive to the kinds of things that are necessary to put people to work and to get them better wages. And so they're going to vote for Mr. Trump on that basis. I understand that. I'm not going to argue with them. I'm not going to spend the coming months campaigning against Mr. Trump and attacking him time and again. I've expressed what my views are, and I'll let the American people make their choice.
But once again, just simply writing in a name, does that demonstrate a lack of political courage, if you will? Because, as you say, it's either going to be Donald Trump, President of the United States, or Hillary Clinton, President of the United States.
Well, for me, this is a question of my own integrity and character. And if there was someone that was an anti-Semite, for instance, and they had all the same positions I had, and they were running for president, I simply could not vote for them. I could not bring myself to do that. And the things that Mr. Trump has said during this campaign and the things he's revealed about himself are such a departure from what I believe in my core that I cannot, in good conscience, vote for him.